The Butterfly's Dream by Kerber's 314, Chapter 33, contingently. Damn it! Uncharacteristic, more than that, unfathomable words coming from her mouth. Anyone who but half knew her would find themselves wondering what strange world they crossed into as they passed the threshold into the dimly lit workshop, second guessing that it was her at all, and not some clever copy designed to fool and deceive. But no, those words had no other source but herself, and this visceral world was, as usual, almost too real. Banishing it all with a sweep of her hand, parts and thoughts scattered throughout the cavernous room, the tinkling of metal and screws and other round objects she knew would later have to be collected rolled about on the floor like fish out of water. Amidst the commotion, it wasn't that hard to hear when one of the pieces stopped cold. "What's the matter, kiddo?" The voice was so familiar, so ingrained in her psyche, that she could feel his wry expression as he bent down to pick up the revolving chamber, weighing it like his words as he tossed them carelessly in his hand. "Forgot how it all goes together? Do you at least remember the song I taught you? The firing pins connected to the extractor connected to the 'It's been a while'? Whether it was meant to be an excuse or as a snip, the result was just the same, making her uncle flinch and palm the scale of the cylinder, delaying the inevitable. He sighed, turning over the mailed up hunk of metal, half-heartedly examining it. But I imagine that's not the issue, huh? No, the knowledge of how to connect all those mismatched parts had never left her. The skill required to find solutions, make compromises, and force things that had no business ever being part of the same whole together was practically written in her DNA. Her hands working along ought to know what to do even if her mind was confused. Resistant though that chunk of fate between her ears might be, her body knew it needed a weapon, just as her team wasn't complete without her friends, Naruto without the QB, or the man behind her without an alcoholic beverage. She needed that intimate piece to make her whole again. What was the hang-up? The offer still stands, you know. Idle hands, devoid of that omnipresent flask, continued to fiddle with the object. I don't mind loaning you her out, especially to, well, family. It hurts that he still couldn't say it. On the other hand, could she even handle this conversation right now, on top of her current struggles? Would that one word break her already tenuous restraint? No, no, she didn't know or know, as in the declaration. That's not what I need right now. Question still oblivious unanswered, the man remained silent. In the awkward pause that followed, she mused that maybe social ineptitude was a more endemic of disease, as he seemingly remembered the object in his hands. Here, a careless toss and an equally careless catch, without turning in her seat or even looking. That's a valuable part. You should take better care of your things. Yeah, agreeing absently, she read the markings on the near pristine cylinder by Braille, tracing the iconic edged snowflake design with her thumb. Weapon is an extension of ourselves, an extension of our soul. Setting it down next to its two-dimensional counterpart on the rough blueprint laid out in front of her, she began musing out loud the issue of things. What is the soul, though? Too broad, not deserving for an answer. It's like my mind is going in one direction, my heart another, and maybe my body not listening to either. Again, rein it in. I wanted to represent myself, who I am, who I've become, and the problem was that even after earning at last the acceptance she'd always desired, she didn't know what it was. A snort echoed from behind her, seeming to match the light of her problem. You're still Ruby. Crow shoved his hands into his pockets, lest they become the devil's playthings. I just wish I had realized that sooner. The second part whispered to himself, but like his hands which betrayed his listlessness, part of him wanted her to hear, wanted her to accept this pitiful apology that was too little and far, far too late. It's okay, turning around with a smile, broadening in response to the dumbfounded expression on her uncle's face. I guess I'm still figuring that out myself. Look, Ruby, hands clenching and unclenching in his pockets as they groped for a flask that was conspicuously absent. I know I've screwed up big time. I should have listened to you. I should have at least come to visit. It's all right. Insisting wasn't enough. Who could ever believe it? I said that, didn't I? Besides, you did. Remember, as often she'd gaze past the bars in her window to the outside where other birds flew unshackled by cages. Every so often there would be a black pair of wings amongst the lot. Unlike the others, it would sit patiently on a branch just out of her reach, chained by its own volition to not partake in the frivolous and merely keep her company with its mysteriously cognizant red eyes. Those same eyes now stared back with a raised eyebrow. "Actually, are you sure you're Ruby? You seem a little too sharp to be her." Tone and shoulders dilated as he realized the poor taste of his own joke. She still giggled though, a tad sorrowful and out of pity. Pity for herself or for the man, it didn't seem to matter. "Like I said, I'm still trying to figure out just who and what I am." "That's more normal than you might think. There's plenty of adults who still have trouble with that question." Allowing one hand to roam free, it ran calloused fingers through hair that hadn't been washed in days. "I know I only know who I am because I'm an alcoholic. Doesn't leave room for much else. Not for being a responsible brother, and not a decent uncle, certainly. Luckily, he seemed to manage multitasking as Osmond's lackey while being shit-faced, and so that worked out pretty well. In fact, he seemed to excel at it, and being sober for this long was taking a toll on his nerves. Even still, I want you to know, Ruby, that I'm always on your side, even if I make a mess of it sometimes." It was odd seeing her aloof uncle so wounded and hopeful, disturbing even. To alleviate both, she cocked her head with a lopsided smile, so the result was almost even. "Sorry, uncle, no boys allowed." Only two people would get the inside joke, and only one would giggle, but she figured she deserved at least a little fun at the man's expense. She shook her head to dismiss the confusion, looking down to another part which had migrated its way into her hands, the flaming heart emblem beaming back up at her. "I'm sorry, but I don't know if that promise really means anything right now, seeing as I don't know which side I really fall on anymore. There's too much fog, too many questions which I know even Osmond can answer. But," setting the bronze grip back up on the table, she bent over to pick up another one of the pieces scattered over the concrete, the silky black ribbon flowing easily in her hands. "You don't need to worry about me. I have people within reach that can help me find the way." Considering the oddly mature words from the oddly mature girl in front of him, trying to decipher the history as laid down on the surface, and just where he could possibly fit between the cracks and fractures that were rapidly being filled in. "You could help me pick up the pieces," she suggested sheepishly with a hand rubbing the back of her head, "if you want to." His old spot no longer existed, but she was offering a new place, or at least a place to start. "Yeah, sure." After doing so, he left her alone once again, where she looked back at the mass of metal on the table and began fiddling again with the construction, unhurriedly this time, weighing the individual components in her hands as Anubis or Peter at the gates. There would never again be another Crescent Rose, just as there would never be another Ruby Rose. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you nor these lords of men. Neither will there be a time when we shall not exist. We all exist from now on, as the soul experience in this body, childhood, youth, and old age, so also it acquires another body. The sage in this is not deluded. "Hey, hey, think it's time to take a break? Stop 'cause we got someone who needs to be awake." Naruto wanted to protest vehemently, but that would require thinking and speaking, things he wasn't confident to take on right then. Instead, he made his will known by groaning and nuzzling his way back into the warm and comfortable spot he had been appropriately occupying for several hours. Ah! Being dropped in on his rear, however, was a surefire way to rectify that issue, words spewing forth from his mouth involuntarily. "What the hell? Yo, this ain't a hotel and I ain't no steed, just helping you 'cause you looked to be in need." Despite the near incomprehensible language which had him juggling Japanese and English in his head for a few seconds, the crude awakening did in fact do a sufficient job of getting his mind kick-started. "Ah, sorry about that." He rubbed his head with muddled chagrin, looking up at the burly man who was still smirking down on him. "Really, B?" The familiar voice and even more accustomed annoying tone was invaluable in clearing the lingering fog from his mind. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't treat our client so carelessly. If anything were to happen to him, I'd have to report you to your brother." Craning his neck, he spied the familiar silhouette framed by the setting sun. "Man, that's cold. I wasn't being that bold. In case you haven't noticed, cold is kind of Samui's M.O." Ignoring both the man and her teammate, who still lingered in the background, Samui leaned over the prone Jinchuriki with something that might have been concern on a normal human. "Are you alright to walk, Uzumaki? Or do you still need to be carried?" "No, no, I'm fine." Embarrassment had him struggling painfully to his feet. Pride pretended to ignore the fact that he almost fell face flat when his knees threatened to give out from underneath him. When he found himself almost steady, he looked up to see the appraising stare of the blond team leader, obviously thankful he could move himself but keeping a watchful eye just in case. Another pair of eyes watched him from the back of the lackadaisical swordsman, and he nearly toppled once again under Karui's scrutiny gaze, but held admirably for the very same reason. "Right," Samui nodded approvingly. "B is correct, though. It would be better if you entered the village on your own 2 feet. It's bad enough that we have one casualty, but for a first impression it wouldn't look good." It was only then that he noticed they had arrived at a pair of gates, what he had presumed to be the entrance of Kumagakure. Blinking to banish the last vestiges of muddy sleep from his eyes, he regarded the white plaster posts practically carved into the jagged rock, and the unadorned wood doors they suspended with a touch of amazement. It wasn't Konoha or even Bell, but it was different. "Omui, you go on ahead with Karui. We'll head to the Raikage to give our report." While the sugar-loving man nodded, the redhead on his back scoffed. Clearly she didn't like being treated like an invalid, and it actually made Naruto feel slightly better about the whole thing. If she could manage to keep an attitude like that, perhaps the injury was not as severe as he had assumed. "What are you looking at?" Under the sudden accusation, he groped to find an appropriate answer. "Let's just go already." There was the briefest flash of a smile before she turned her head back into the scarf around her partner's neck, and they took off. Naruto realized only after that he had a similar expression on his own face as he watched them leave. It was strange, the looks he was getting, people turning their heads as he passed by to whisper amongst themselves. Not that he wasn't used to that in and of itself. Between the fox and his own eccentricities, he was always the subject of conversation around Konoha. There was just a foreignness within the faces which had nothing to do with the hue of their skin or rugged dress. He'd long since recognized that humans, and faunas for that matter, were the same on either world, but here there was an implacable difference. "Don't mean to pry, but I'm just that kind of guy." His peculiar savior brought Naruto back to the small group he traveled with. "Mr. Eight's just wondering what you did to make Foxy so sedate. He says you must be pretty amazing to take on nine fire a-blazing." In the short time since he'd been introduced to Killer Bee, he'd grown somewhat used to the man's method of talking. Therefore, it wasn't the way the question was asked which gave him pause, but rather the fact that his fellow Jinchuriki was being so blatant about their status in public. Um, he looked around to see the same volume of noise, unchanged since he'd last looked. "What? Speaking for the Hachibi, apparently your tailed beast has chilled out since they last met." Samui supplied an objective translation. "I'm not sure you can rely on B's rhyming, but it would seem to me that this is quite the accomplishment." "I don't know what that. I don't know about that. The fox was always kind enough to me." "That's a pretty weak way of saying I've saved your ass more than once." Unfortunately, the teasing tempo to this statement was lost in the gruffness, and it was obvious Naruto was already uncomfortable with this attention directed to him. "Admittedly, I don't think I would have been quite so eager to help if you hadn't changed me so significantly. Still, I didn't really think I was that bad." Could this statement really be trusted in, though? Memories, so subjective, often fail us. "I wouldn't know." Samui dismissed herself from being intermittently. "Man, don't be so shy. That kind of thing ain't gonna fly. You got to learn to smile, and with that their hearts beguile." All this said with a broad grin which stretched his silvery white broad beard across his tanned face like fresh snow covering a battlefield. It was only as that joyous expression disseminated to the passing crowd that he realized he was not wearing his usually jubilant face, even the mask failing to deploy in this strange scenario. Correcting this, he was even more shocked to find it returned in kind by strangers whom he'd never met. "That's a better look for a hero, better than fear, yo." "Hero?" clenching up to his savior with amusement. He again felt the child as the man chuckled at his confusion. Sure, I beat pain, but I bet you would have been able to. The hum was low and non-comical, simply simple compared to the flamboyant poetry, but perhaps that's why it was so arresting. Maybe, supplementing the sober part of the conversation, Salmi proved a good foil for the exuberant man. But that's not why you're seen in such a respectable light here in Kumo. It's because of your actions to rescue Ni Yujito from the Akatsuki. In comparison, B's abstract speech made more sense to him than this bizarre statement. But I was the reason. Doesn't matter. Something akin to a snap coming from the chill woman took him aback. Realizing this, she continued on in a much softer voice, eyes not meeting his as they continued to scan the crowd, which were steadily becoming more excitable the further along in their walk they went. The fact is that you mounted an operation on your own to rescue a ninja from a foreign nation. This single act went a long way into thawing the rather frigid relations since the last Shinobi World War. It could even be considered the principal factor allowing the Kage to sit down at the table. Turning just enough to regard him out of the corner of her eye, he realized that she held the same sort of admiration he was just starting to recognize in the faces of the population, carefully guarded though behind that frosted shin. A single act of selflessness might not erase the decades of suspicion, but it's a start. But it's a lie, Naruto hissed out from the corner of his mouth, trying still not to upset the mood that was being cultivated. Is it? Yujito-san is. She was a fellow Jinchuriki. I couldn't let the Katsuki get a hold of the Nibi. Shame was impossible to keep from spreading like a pox to his face. But I couldn't even do that. As I said, it doesn't matter. Admiration lost as she rolled her eyes. All the public sees is a foreign shinobi sticking their neck out for one of our own. Being such a strategic asset to our village makes it even more a boon in the eye of our council. Don't you understand? Growling with frustration as he realized she couldn't, he turned to B, but realized the man was pointedly ignoring the two of them. It was all because she wasn't jerky, because the public doesn't know that. Someone informed him as emotionally as if she were telling him he had cancer. Nor do they know about the details around her capture, and for many reasons we'd like to keep it that way, at least as long as we can. But that's a lie. Both heads whipped to the profound voice and inflection question. Riddle me this, little man. If you'd never heard of B. George and Jerky, would you have done the same thing? Even more than the non-verbal hum, this serious B was disconcerting, throwing him totally off kilter from the conversation he was precariously balancing. Or maybe it was a question. No Biju, no Kurama, no Ruby. They were all a part of who he was. Would he have developed the same all alone? It was impossible to imagine himself without them. Possibly that was the secret. He couldn't imagine himself any other way. Yeah, if there was someone in need, there would be no second guessing for him. I would. There you go. B turned back to challenge him to a shit-eating grin contest, to which Naruto happily met. Now you know, although don't want to give you a scare, but you best be prepared. You're going to meet A, clarifying for the unspoken question. Naruto wasn't comforted by the slight smirk on the cool blonde's lips. B's brother, the Raikage. Never fret, you haven't met him yet. I was talking more on our trip. Compared to that, this is just a blip. Pending on the Raikage's approval. Don't be like that, dealing with bro's old hat. Oh, like that last time you tried to sneak out and he sentenced you to D-rank missions for a month? Hey, talking about that ain't chill. All I wanted was a little thrill. It seems like you and Uzumaki are two of a kind. I wonder how good an idea this was in the first place. Bah, no need to fear. Why? I bet your pretty little rear. Ow, 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 my ear! Like oil on water, a light atmosphere was keeping them afloat, even if it were just the veneer. Did that mean it wasn't real? That mixture was life after all? It didn't need to yield a solution, just keep their heads up until they could fix the underlying problem. Life, though, is a deep, perilous river. Standing in front of the headmaster's desk, with no idea how she got there, no recollection of falling asleep after the talk with the Raikage, and no idea when or how she made it up the skyscraper tower, operating as if sleepwalking, as if that wasn't what they did every day. She was still groggy, creaking her neck that she couldn't massage out, and her clothes still smelled like grease and charcoal. If she were to look in the mirror, there would likely be more smudges on her face than pale skin, and she would be willing to bet her silver eyes were bloodshot. It was a safe assumption that she'd spent the night at the school's workshop fiddling around with designs. Glancing at her left, her uncle didn't look to be in much better shape, probably getting less sleep than her and showing it in the way he twitched and shifted from leg to leg listlessly. Caffeine no doubt added to this. The coffee in his hand, the second cup since he'd entered the room. That she'd noticed, that is, trading one addiction for another it seemed. It had made her wonder even more how she'd ended up here, as he hardly appeared capable of dragging his own 2 feet, let alone her meager burden. The intel you gathered stated increased activity around Mount Glen area, correct? I don't know, Oz. It was on the report. Did you read it or didn't you? Crow asked flippantly while taking a sip, wrinkling his nose at the soreness of the brew, nonetheless continuing to drink it as it succeeded in keeping him awake. On the surface, the headmaster appeared far more collected than either of his subordinates, but if one were to look closely, they would see the thin but deep gouges incising themselves under his eyes, carefully hidden by the rims of his glasses. But it was much harder for him to hide his own impatience, which was probably why he was sitting down lest he pace a new hole in the floor. It was impossible to disguise the glare he shot the dusty old huntsman, however. Look, everything I found pointed to it being a major base of operations, the man defended with wide gestures, forcing Ruby to dodge as he spilled some of his coffee in the process. The supply routes the White Fang were using led that direction. They were moving tons of cargo, big shit too, serious military hardware. There'd be no other place to hide that kind of thing except for the abandoned buildings or the underground rail yard. And we had James follow up on that, as per your suggestion. Osmond nodded his acceptance to Ruby, who was feeling more ornamental and less patient as the conversation went on around her. The Atlesian Jagdkardem commando team turned up next to nothing, a few traces of camp here and there, but nothing to indicate size of operation or what they stored. And if I were to guess, no way to tell when they packed up shop or where they went. You would be correct, Osman admitted with tangible frustration. It's almost like they vanished into thin air, leaving us with no leads. The White Fang are operating much more materialistically, and I doubt it's solely due to the recent change in leadership. Adam Torres may have radical ideas, but he lacks the military background for proper execution. His successes are based on trial and error. Until now, someone is clearly teaching his forces how to move and operate with efficiency. I hate to ask this so late in the game, but are we sure it's her? Unsure of the words coming out of his own mouth, Crow appeared dazed, disoriented, like someone had hit him with a 2x4 and left him to pick himself up out of the gutter. Who do we know that has the kinds of skills and resources to pull off an operation like that? Never mind a reason. All things being equal, the simplest answer is not always the one we want to hear. I will not entertain this kind of talk, Osmond declared coldly, resolute in the face of uncertainly crawling up the walls. Not against a sovereign kingdom, and certainly not against an ally. And why not? Coffee mug set down before it was entered as a weapon. Your old buddy Jimmy seems more than happy to march his wind-up army down our streets in broad daylight like he owns the place. What makes you so sure he's not doing the same thing under our noses? And what, work with the White Fang? Sarcasm was unbecoming of Ospen, and as sure a sign as any that the rationale of the conversation was degenerating rapidly. We already know that when the chips are down, they're willing to work with humans so that we slaughter each other. The thoughts of Roman and Neil languishing behind bars drew her mind away from the unpleasantries and this pointless argument. And do you really believe that croak about stealing the prototype from Atlas with their security? How do we know they didn't just hand it over as part of an agreement to carve Val up amongst themselves. Thoughts about the relatively honest criminals were easily dismissed as she latched on to this rhetorical question. A previous her might have believed that it wasn't possible, that human could never be so self-centered as to contemplate such a foolish idea. The knowledge of mutually assured destruction, a deterrent from any kind of revival of inter-kingdom warfare, but a more mature, let's say experienced Ruby knew that this was not the case. In the end, people would go through whatever means to realize their agendas, no matter whom they hurt. The two of them were no different in that regard. The lie that they weren't hurting anyone kept them pushing forward blindly for so long, unappreciative, of the hearts they trampled over in the process. Would she not see the world burn just so that they could be together? To her greatest shame and remorse, this question still needed to be answered. The truth was always the same. People were always the same. The man sitting behind the desk was a person just like anyone else, and in that moment she realized she was staring down back at a familiar face, the one of doubt. And what would you have me do? Swallowing, trying to drown that doubt, rubbing unaccustomed stubble on his chin. Throw away everything that I've worked for, declare war on the rest of the world, mistrust my closest allies, people who I've known for longer than you've been alive. Too weak to offer any more resistance, Crow shrugged bonelessly. Doesn't feel good, does it? To be forced to question everything you thought you knew? No, it certainly doesn't. Where once she was an ornament, now she was the chief devourer with the eyes of everyone on the room on her. I said that aloud, didn't I? Next to her, her uncle ran a hand over his wiry face, and Osmond allowed the barest of smiles to penetrate that overbearing gloom. Something to add, Miss Rose? No, she replied out of habit and embarrassment. Maybe, she amended out of hope and faith. It depends. Are you going to listen to what I have to say? Would her voice be heard above that overlying din of preconceived notions and traitorous rationale? When all plausible options have been exhausted, the only remaining options are the implausible. Osmond's smile gained a somber note as these same questions filtered past eyes shaded by rose-colored glasses. At this point, I don't think there's any other word that would mean so much as much. He leaned back and spread his arms wide in surrender acceptance. I'm all ears, so she told him, and he listened. Later, with a smile, Ruby would ride the conventionally slow elevator down from Cloud 9, her uncle unaccustomedly stoic and sober next to her. You still think I'm crazy, don't you? Eyes never leaving the illuminated numbers, creeping downwards, smile never leaving her face. It's okay. I think Osmond does too now. Not that a bottle of booze wouldn't make the transition easier. Restraining himself from reaching for said bottle, which wasn't there, and avoiding looking at his niece. I've seen and heard some pretty strange things working for us. I think the most bizarre part was seeing the old man confused. Ruby giggled with only mild resistance. Crow joined her with a throaty chuckle. It was also a little worrying, returning to the seriousness his white blood cells had yet to cure. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think he's desperate, grasping at straws. A light narrowing of her eyes at this insinuation. I told you I am on your side, Ruby, but you have to admit that this is a lot to take in. How can we be sure Oz believes you? I know he made promises, but I have no idea if he intends to keep them or will even be able to. Furthermore, how are you sure this Naruto will be able to help us? I don't, she answered with the same levity, making it seem upon first glance like she wasn't taking this seriously. But I have faith. Everything will work out. Before he could admonish his niece for her naivety, she turned to him with a face that might have been painted centuries ago. Osmond probably knows that I'm using him, just like he's been using me. Silver eyes sparkled, radiating voices from faraway stars. But that's the beauty of it. The truth still might be that we don't understand one another, but we don't have to. We're both meeting in the middle with something real. Trust. Cocking her head, she regarded the continued puzzled look on her uncle's face. And in the end, isn't that what friendship is? Amidst the gentle hum of the electromagnetics, the other huntsman regarded his niece, trying to decide if she was insane or a genius, wondering what the difference was anyways. In my experience, giving trust only leads to people breaking it. We're not dealing with your experience, we're dealing with mine. He had nothing to say to this, coming to such a gentle stop that they didn't notice their journey was over until the doors opened with a low hiss and Ruby practically skipped outside into the hall, stopping though, turning around to her uncle who was still frozen in a combination of contemplation and bewilderment. I'd give you my word, if it meant anything. I could promise that it would be all right, that I'd do everything I could to ensure that it is, but that wouldn't mean much, would it? Not so long as he harbored his own doubts, which he toted with him wherever he went. No, he admitted. Suppose not. Stepping out of the car himself before the automatic doors closed shut on him, he noticed his niece being tugged in another direction than the dorms back to the origin of that grime coating her. You're not going back to your team? She shook her head. No, they know what I've been up to and that it might take me a while, but the smile which hadn't waned only got stronger. It won't be long. I know what I'm doing now. Behind her, she could feel his crimson gaze, the thoughts she left him with slowly smoldering in that mind which had been drowned in alcohol for so long. Maybe he would get it soon enough, and if he ever dated, that was okay too. She wasn't entirely sure what she was doing was right or true. Between thoughts and action lay the shadow. She was tied to action, to a path that wouldn't allow that shadow to survive.